our emotional self in the amygdala, which is our innate me, the me we are born with, has intelligence and has a capacity for learning, has discrimination. For instance, it is through amygdala that you are able to read social cues, such as understand other people's facial expressions or the tone of their voice, which is obviously very important for social interactions. But what it is lacking is capacity for reflective thinking. It cannot reflect. And because of that, its learning capacity is also limited. Alone, it is not really able to evolve very far. It's mostly, it stops at the level of assuring, to some extent, our basic survival in this reality, fitting into this reality, our basic functioning in this reality. Because of that limitation, at some point of our evolution, the mind has developed. Which has the capacity for abstract thinking, for reflective thinking, where you are not simply reacting, but you can take a step back and think about the situation or about a concept, trying to find a solution. Mind is very important. And the mind, in fact, looking from the very high standpoint, is a manifestation of the emotional self. The mind in itself alone, if you think about it, is really nothing. It has no life. It has no self. It's empty. It's like a mind of a processing system of a computer. Computer has value because it serves someone like us who have sense of self. We can use it. But computer for his own sake is nothing. So the mind actually exists for the sake of that center of me, which happens to be located in amygdala. When you feel a sense of self in the mind, which you should, I mean, everybody does a little bit, even before the person is awakened, that sense of self is actually coming from the me in amygdala. It's a projection into the mind. But this is not what I wanted to talk about. The mind represents the capacity for rational thinking. Very important to help us exist in this reality, solve our problems. And of course, very important as our intelligence develops further into the inquiry into the nature of reality and so forth. But the problem with the mind that is supposed to be rational, that is affected by the irrational emotional self. Because that's the thing about amygdala, that it can be, even though it has a practical means to help us survive in this reality. So at the same time, it's overwhelmed by all these emotions that it is processing and just becoming irrational. Amygdala is irrational. That's the problem. When you experience crazy thoughts, obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and you keep thinking and thinking and thinking about things which you're not really solving anything, you're just keeping thinking about the same things, because somehow you are emotionally addicted to the content of those thoughts. It's the mind is not the problem. If you want to find solution in the mind, like trying to train your mind not to think so much, it can help a little bit, but it does not solve the problem, because the problem is in amygdala. And here we have a very interesting situation. I spoke before about the split between the emotional self, the duality or separation between the emotional self and the emotions we experience in the body. But here we have a very similar situation, duality in the mind or in the consciousness between amygdala and the mind. And the reason for the duality is that while the mind has developed, which is an expression of amygdala, the amygdala, or that emotional self that exists there, has not evolved in itself. It still remains unconscious. It becomes conscious through this, all the things around that are happening in us, but it's not conscious in itself. It's not really aware of its own existence. In a way, its existence is obvious. It's like, it has been always there and always is there. But on the other hand, it's like no one knows that me. that innate me, that self, which is at the base of everything around happening. And it's kind of like, they say, if you look for it, you cannot find. If you stop looking, you find it. Here is a little bit similar, not similar at all, but still there's some similarity in the sense that if you don't look for it, that me in amygdala is obviously there, and you just know it without thinking. But the moment you try to look for it, you cannot find it. So it's kind of opposite to the sentence I mentioned. If you look for it, you cannot find it. If you stop looking, you find it. Here is, if you don't look for it, you find it. And when you start looking for it, you cannot find it. It's kind of opposite, but one sentence here is missing because you do need to look for it and find it. You just need to look for it in a correct way, which is more subtle, and I will speak of it later on. But what I'm saying here is that that sentence is pretty obvious. That me, that presence, that self, it's pretty obvious, but it's unconscious. It's going to be hiding in the plain sight. And in itself, it has not evolved. And that center, I mostly call it an emotional self because that was, at least initially, its primary function. And that emotional self just doesn't evolve in itself. It evolves in the context of the body, the context of the mind, and later on in the context of consciousness, but still not in itself. So, the split. The mind is rational, amygdala is irrational. The mind, the purpose of the mind from the emotional standpoint, it's supposed to give a rational point of reference to our emotional experiences. But it cannot achieve it because irrational amygdala is constantly sabotaging it. So it's an interesting development here because the mind is manifestation of amygdala, and yet amygdala is still separated from it. Emotional self. I don't. It's better to use this than just anatomical terms. Well, evolution is not perfect. Existence is trying to make us evolve. Things are evolving, but there's always something that get imperfect, skewed. That's an example. So, irrational thoughts are emotional. But not because the mind in itself is emotional, it is not, but because it is being affected by amygdala. So you by the emotional self, you think you experience emotions in the mind, but you actually experience emotions in the emotional self. which is trying to solve these emotions by thinking about them, and it cannot. There's a conflict between these two. Why do you think all the mind-based therapies do not work? People trying to solve their problems, trying to understand their psychological issues, and on and on. They're trying to do it in the mind, alone, not understanding the mind alone. The mind is not a problem. The problem is emotional self. You need to go deeper to understand your emotional and psychological dimension in the mind, to the root. So if you try just to solve your issues in the mind, it might work when it might appear to work when you are emotionally calm, but the moment intense emotions arise, or different emotional tendencies arise from the emotional self, the mind gets agitated again. It cannot control those emotions. They are just too much. And the question is how to unify emotional self with the mind. How to integrate these two so that the emotional and the rational part of our intelligence can operate harmoniously. Imagine situation that you experience strong emotions in the mind. I'm sure you had many of them. You can just recollect, bring them, relive it in the moment. So there are two layers of experience there. One is the thoughts themselves, trying to reflect on the situation, or trying to respond to whatever challenges are coming from the external reality. And then there's emotional part. Each thought is tied to that emotional energy, which is coming from the emotional center, emotional self. And when this emotional energy is very intense, and there's a lot of fear, insecurity, and whatnot in amygdala, you cannot really think clearly. Your thoughts become chaotic and agitated. This is how you recognize what somebody called it amygdala hijack, because we are hijacked by amygdala. The mind is hijacked. You can identify this happening by the fact that you cannot control your thoughts. Your thoughts are just out of control. They become agitated. There are different modes the mind can create to deal with that stress, because, in a similar way as you have stress in your body, you can create stress in your mind. The mind is just too stressed. So sometimes it explodes. This is the explosion of anger or strong emotion comes into the picture. There are many different scenarios, because the mind simply cannot bear that stress and needs to express it somehow to experience release. So how to unify these two? First of all, you need to separate. Before you unify them, you need to actually to separate the emotional energy in thoughts from thoughts themselves. Because you cannot find solution to intense emotions in the mind without embodying those emotions. If you try to find solution, you need the mind, obviously, to help you, but the mind alone cannot find the solution, because it's using its mental capacity to solve emotional issues. While you need to embody your emotional energy fully as the place from which you can relate to your emotions in a rational way. It's a very simple exercise. If you imagine situations that you get very emotional in the mind, feel the emotion. If you're, while having, doesn't matter if the emotion is intense or less intense or very intense, just embody that emotion. Don't try to solve it through the mind, just embody it first. If you are able to embody your emotions in the mind, then the mind becomes actually calm. In the case of amygdala hijack, the mind becomes chaotic. This is how you can identify. It becomes crazy, becomes irrational. The mind becomes irrational. The mind, which was supposed to be rational, actually becomes irrational, out of control. This is how That's why people sometimes react in a crazy manner, or you are surprised by someone's reactions, or they completely change from what you thought they were because of some emotional triggers and what the mind is doing to them. How the mind is being hijacked in them. That irrational part of the human beings is, like, it's really deep. That's why, there's this concept that people don't change because how can you change something so irrational and so rooted in the unconscious? So they don't change, they just, live through the kind of personality they created initially. Nothing really changes, but it can change if you bring consciousness to that which is irrational. I'm not speaking here about healing and so forth, because there are more important things than healing. Emotional awakening is more important. Healing without emotional awakening cannot go very deep. If you have an emotional problem, you might have many emotional problems, but actually you have only one emotional problem. You are unconscious in your emotional self. You are unconsciously rooted in that part of yourself which is fundamentally irrational. Emotion experience in the mind is connected to thought, and thought is connected to certain information, so that this emotion can be experienced as relating to something. So it's already a manifested emotion. You see, the emotion in the amygdala are not pre-manifested, meaning they don't come into consciousness. They get manifested through the body or through the mind. So here, emotion is manifested in the mind. And if you feel that emotion, you actually feel your emotional self, because that emotion is how the emotional self feels. It's not created by the mind, the emotion. It's manifestation of the emotional self. And if you are able to embody that emotion, within the presence of thought, it means that you experience that emotion truly consciously and from emotional self. And I call it pure emotion. Pure emotion in the mind. So if you are one with that emotion that is connected to a thought, means you're also one with the emotional self. And it also means the emotional self becomes conscious. And because when it becomes conscious, it can stop being irrational and it can use the rational part of consciousness, which is the mind, really for its own sake, for what it was supposed to be created. The split, I repeat myself, between amygdala and the mind, between the emotional self and the mind, is the very cause of all our emotional imbalances and irrationality. On that level, even though that we have developed the mind so much, we are really emotionally extremely primitive. And it's time to change it. Unification, same like unification of the emotional self with the body. Emotional self has to be unified with the mind. Remember, mind is innocent. Mind is never irrational. Mind may be not very intelligent at times, but it's not irrational. It's maybe ignorant, but not emotionally irrational, because it doesn't have emotions. So if you experience agitation in the mind, which is obviously emotional, it's not from the mind, it's from the emotional center that is hijacking your mind, is preventing it from thinking rationally. It's not even about our thinking that one of the reasons that people think all the time is also amygdala hijack. Not only because they cannot stop thinking, probably they cannot, but they can certainly think less. But they have to think because they are constantly trying to secure their space, their existence, due to the intrinsic fear and agitation and restlessness and whatnot coming from the emotional self in amygdala. They keep thinking and thinking and thinking and so forth. It's even though thoughts don't appear to be agitated emotionally, they are certainly emotionally influenced. So, we'll continue. It's an important subject, and I understand that for some of you may be elusive because it's very subtle. It's extremely subtle, no doubt about that. But for now, I want you to experiment with the mind and emotions in the mind. Not processing emotions in the mind. That part of the teaching remains the same. We are not processing emotions in the mind. We are surrendering emotions to the body. But there's also place in the mind for pure experience of emotions. naturally. Mind is part of is an extension of our emotional self. Because when you are processing emotions in the mind, you are trying to solve with that what appears to be rational something that cannot be solved because it is being constantly disturbed by the irrational. There's no solution for it. That's why you surrender emotions to the body, and you can experience them there in a pure way and direct way, in a healthy way. But naturally, you can experience emotional states in the head, like, joy or sadness. And you can experience, especially in action, when you are interacting with the world, certain emotions, specific emotions that are also connected to the mind. And one way to uh, to release that emotional burden in the head is do as we have been doing. If you can, surrender emotions to the body. But it doesn't mean that you don't experience any emotions in the mind. It means that you are not processing them, and it means that you experience them in a pure way. So, in that exercise, when you experience strong emotions, become one with these emotions, embody them. Which allows you to become one with your emotional self. Actually, emotional self become conscious of itself through these emotions. So the weight is in emotion and embodying it, not in the thought. Thought is secondary. And the thought is secondary as it should be, then it can think rationally. And has much more chance to find resolution. If there's some emotional difficult situation. And if the thoughts, this one of the signs here is if the thoughts get out of control, the chaotic, the disorganized, the repetitive, it means you have lost that oneness with emotion and you are being amygdala hijacked. You do not need to change your emotions. Do not fight with your emotions. Don't judge your emotions. Even if they are ridiculous, there is no reason for that. It's okay. All you need to do is to be one with these emotions. No, in a normal situation, we experience our emotions through or from our thoughts. And what you want to do is the opposite. You want to experience your thoughts from pure emotions. In a manner of speaking.